So I am super excited to be joined by Judith Matloff on WokeAF Daily. She teaches crisis reporting at Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. But my God, folks, I'm going to hold on to the title of her book. The title of her book is How to Drag a Body and Other Safety Tips You Hope to Never Need. It is like a book of the times. Judith, you wrote this pre-corona, but we were in pandemics before, a la Trump, and and climate change, and and everything else. But I want to get to your book and the fact that you teach crisis reporting. You are a reporter that has been in the midst of some of the most, I would say, terrifying, right? Conflict areas in the world. Can you give us just a kind of snapshot into your career, and then we'll move into kind of the birth of this book. But I would love for you to be able to give WokeAF listeners like this more idea, deeper dive into who you are and how you got into crisis reporting.
I got into it by accident, like a lot of things in life. I was a foreign correspondent for quite a few years for Reuters, the Christian Science Monitor. I worked for a Mexican newspaper for a while. And the thing is, you can't be a foreign correspondent without at some point coming across a crisis. And particularly when you're working in Latin America, you're working in this former Soviet Union, you're working in Africa, you're dealing with societies that are going through a lot of tumult and oftentimes violence. So among the stories that I covered was the Rwandan genocide. I can't tell you how many civil wars, militias, natural disasters, galore. And then what happened, and this wasn't by choice, it was just, I mean, I wasn't seeking out violent situations or crisis situations. It just was part of the job. And then while I was doing it, I was like, when I started out, like we didn't wear flak jackets in wars. We didn't have safety protocols. Friends were being kidnapped, raped, killed, maimed, tortured. I can't tell you how many colleagues I've lost. And I began to think, I had quite a few close calls myself, including death threats. And I began to think, we need to do this like a slightly more intelligent way than like drinking champagne on the flight home saying, yay, I survived that one. So when I returned,
although that is you would be well rewarded to do that, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
You survived.
Yeah, exactly. I would prefer bourbon or mezcal, but anyway, you get the idea. It was sort of like we need to have some foresight. So when I came back to the States 20 years ago exactly, and was offered a job at Columbia, one thing they wanted me to teach was conflict reporting. And I began to incorporate safety into my teaching because I felt like the new generation had to do things in a way that was smarter than the way I did it. And then what happened was I started teaching a lot of workshops, particularly in Mexico and Latin America, where, as you know, the narco violence is just totally out of control. I started teaching a lot of safety workshops in other parts of the world, the West Bank, Nigeria, again, all over Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happened was, this is what led me to the book. Suddenly I became like this go-to person. Like a friend would come up to me and say, I'm going to go visit family in Puerto Rico this summer, but what do I do about hurricanes? How do I prepare for it? Or I'm going down to Central America, or I'm going down to Venezuela. What do I do about Zika? Or somebody else would say, I'm going to the Middle East for work. What do I have to do in terms of kidnapping? Or even just like the plumber across the street was like, dude, what do I do about my house, with flooding? So I began to think, why didn't I just like put this all in a book? And then I could just hand the book to people and say, everything you want to know about natural disasters, rape, sexual harassment, digital security, riots, violent demonstrations, police brutality, it's all there. Here's my book. So that's how it happened. And the weird thing is that
the one weird thing, Judith.
Well, this is the really weird thing. So I actually had a section in the book about pandemics. And my editor at the time said, well, this is just too freaky. We don't need this. This is like too extreme. It's not going to happen here. So we removed that section. It's the only part of the book that didn't make it in. But there is quite a lot in the book that is relevant to powering through this sort of situation. Emotional resilience, when you go through a very traumatic crisis, even how to shelter in place. I have a whole chapter on sheltering in place and how to make that more a more pleasant experience than you might think it would be. So yeah, so here I am, and in kind of crisis city without having anticipated this would ever happen here.
So let me ask you this. Traumatic crisis, right? Obviously, we've been doing the show remote now. God, I guess we're in 4 or 5 months. I have lost track of time.
Yeah.
And, I have been talking a lot about mental health, taking care of your mental health, taking care of your physical health, because we know that it is the most vulnerable among us, right? With pre-existing conditions and the like that are falling ill and are part of the 2 to 3% that are dying of COVID. So I've been very aggressive about these 2 things over the past several months. But what I'm noticing when I'm talking to friends, when I'm talking to, colleagues, is what I am seeing as collective trauma.
Mm-hmm.
What are you seeing in terms of what people are going through now, but also how this is going to affect us as a society as a whole, but the world, because we're all going through variations of the same thing, even those that still believe that this isn't really happening. Right. There is some type of mental trauma that is unfolding.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I just had a piece this morning in the Daily Beast on that very topic. The thing is that so far the data is limited because we're new into this crisis, as you said, only 4 months. But the data that has been collected so far in surveys by, for instance, Case Western Reserve University shows that the level of trauma right now, there are 4 different indicators of post-traumatic stress, which I think most people are not suffering. But there are different ways that trauma manifests itself. And what they found in the study of more than 800 people was that nearly 90% of everybody surveyed was suffering 1 or 2 of the main indicators of diagnostic post-traumatic stress. And I think, the thing about trauma is you often only see the ramifications later. Mm-hmm. And our mental health system here, let alone in less developed societies like Venezuela or Nigeria, which don't have these kind of rich resources that we do as a nation. I don't think the mental health system is going to be able to cope with the demand of that's going to be created with time. And it's something that is really, really concerning. I share your concern, and it's something that I think we're only going to really see the full ramifications of it several months hence. But, the good thing is, and, I've seen this a lot with the many crisis zones I've worked in, is that people are resilient and people are adaptable and people can pull through. The one thing which will help people pull through the most is social support and social network. And I think that's been one of the problems of this crisis, because people have been isolated and they've been stuck in one place and they haven't been able to connect the way they normally do. But I think if people can work on that one element in their life, which is maintaining contact, getting support wherever they can, whether it be friends or professionally or whatever, but having that social network is really will help people the most. And then taking care of themselves physically, sleeping well, eating well, getting exercise is critical.
It's funny because I'm a incredible, this is not a shock to anybody. I'm a incredibly social person. And so at the beginning of the quarantine was very devastating to me, right? The missing out on my friends and routines and all of these things. And I have found that I am actually aggressively checking in on people. I'm actually more so trying to set up time to talk, to text, to Zoom, to do all of those things, because I need the connection. But then I also know that if there are friends that have fallen silent, even on just an emoji here to let me, you're all right, type of thing, then I dive in. And I think that it is that desire to just feel connected, right?
Yeah.
I'm fortunate to be able to be sheltering with my family, because I think that if I was doing so alone, I'm one of those people that would have lost their mind. Like I like that would not have worked for me. Tell me about the exclusion of the pandemic part. Is that going to be its own separate book? Because I want you to dive into what seemed too crazy to put into this book.
It was about Ebola, and Ebola was a different type of pandemic. It was located in one, and still is today. I mean, we're having a new outbreak now in Congo. It was located in just one area. I did not experience SARS or MERS, M-E-R-A. So those were not part of my immediate experience. But, you know, I think even epidemiologists, it was so inconceivable to so many people that a global pandemic of this type could happen in our lifetimes. Of course, scientists had done studies and they had thought about, yes, it could happen, but to be able to comprehend it was so difficult for so many people. So I don't blame my editor at all for just saying this is just too extreme, because, and also Ebola in itself is, it's like a disease made out of a B horror movie. I mean, it is the most horrible way to die. I mean, like your body is just exploding in every way, and it's just so horrific. It is probably like one of the most horrific diseases and ways to die. Whereas Corona, there's something almost subtle and nuanced about Corona. You know, you get a bad cough, and you can go to, you know, whatever. So I think Ebola in itself was just too hard for people to relate to who hadn't lived in a society. But, you know, the coping skills, psychologically, as you mentioned, also just preparing, you know, one thing which concerns me is if you live in an area which is prone to natural disasters like wildfires in the West and the Southwest, or hurricanes here in, you know, in the South and in the East. Now is the time to prepare. You know, we may not have been prepared that well for the pandemic, the health emergency, but we really need to be prepared now for a health emergency with a natural disaster if you live in a place which is prone to it. So, and you know, the theme of the book is if you prepare for things and you can actually anticipate the worst case scenario and plan to mitigate it, you're actually going to feel calmer because you have a plan.